Coming up at New Day at Arirang. South Korea begins its shift to the Living with COVID-19 scheme Monday, easing a handful of strict distancing restrictions that have been in place for months. At the G20, President Moon Jae-in on Sunday reaffirmed that South Korea will complete the phasing out of coal-fired power generation by 2050 and contribute to achieving carbon neutrality on a global level. And Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party won a clear majority in the country's national election Sunday, securing support for Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's legislative agenda.
Hello and welcome to a fresh week of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on the first day of November here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Mark Broom.
And I'm Kim Mo-gyan. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world.
But our top story this morning, South Korea has started its new Living with COVID-19 scheme, a process of gradually easing some of the social distancing rules that we've been living under now for months on end.
Now, there are changes related to private gatherings and operating hours for businesses across the country. For more on this, we have our Choi Won-jung in the studio. Welcome back, Won-jung.
Good morning.
Now, can you tell us about the changes that we're expecting from today?
Yes, so let's begin with the private gatherings. Now, take a look at the screen up on your screen right now. In the greater Seoul area, social gatherings of up to 10 people with 6 of the group fully vaccinated are allowed at restaurants and coffee shops, with up to 12 people allowed in other areas as long as 8 people are fully jabbed. But you need to remember that cafes and restaurants, those who are not fully vaccinated, can only meet in groups of up to 4.
And tell us more then about the restrictions on the business hours of cafes and restaurants. What changes have been made there?
Right, so in the greater Seoul area on the level 4 distancing, cafes and restaurants have closed by 10 p.m. And starting Monday, the operating hours for those facilities are lifted so they can operate around the clock. But for those considered as high-risk facilities such as clubs and specific bars, their business hours are until midnight.
And Won-jung, we also hear that people are being required to, show some kind of certificate that they have been vaccinated or they're tested negative of COVID-19. Tell us more on that.
Right, so it's so-called the vaccine pass is required when entering places that are considered as high-risk, the exposures. And now that we're talking about the singing rooms and the saunas and gyms and bars plus hospitals, proving your fully vaccinated status is simple. Now through an app called the KUV by using Naver or Kakao, or paper documents issued by the local health centers, regardless of vaccination status, showing a negative PCR test result taken within 48 hours. It can also be presented instead. However, if you are below 18 years old or unable to get vaccinated due to underlying conditions, you are exempt. There's also some good news for moviegoers and sports fans. If you're fully vaccinated, you're now allowed to eat popcorns and have drinks at theaters and get chicken and beer and baseball games.
Yeah, I always wondered why you couldn't eat popcorn in the cinema anyway,
right,
or what difference it would make to the spread of the virus eating chicken at a baseball game, but there we go. And let's shift gears to vaccination. Vaccinations ongoing here in Korea. What's the status as of now?
So starting Monday, the children aged between 12 to 15 are eligible to get the Pfizer shot. And according to the health officials, more than 490,000 children have signed up for the shots, which is only 26% of those eligible. The vaccination will start from November 1st until November 27th, and the booster shots will also begin too for people with a weakened immune system, including leukemia patients and people who've had organ transplants.
Won-jung, also tell us about the current, how many COVID-19 cases are we expecting for today?
So today's figure will be a little bit lower than the previous day due to fewer tests conducted over the weekend. Now, from midnight to 9 p.m., 1,413 cases were reported, and that's 260 people more than the caseload from last Sunday. However, due to Halloween celebrations in some high population areas, the figure could change in the next coming days.
Well, due to my working schedule, perhaps it was the same for you, Mo-gyan, but my Halloween was, I was in bed at like 8:30 p.m.
Oh, that's good.
But before you go, Tell us a bit more about the government updates, because we believe the daily briefing, there's going to be a change in the format in regards to those from today onwards.
That's absolutely right. So as you know, we've been reporting COVID daily COVID figures in the morning ever since the pandemic began. But from now on, instead of releasing the daily caseload first, the South Korean health authorities will announce the death toll and the number of severe cases and number of hospitalized patients and confirmed cases in that order. Now, this comes as the authorities decided to make a gradual transition to normal by shifting their focus from number of positive cases to severely ill cases instead, which is very interesting.
Indeed. Now, okay, thank you, Won Jung, for your report. It's good to have you back in the studio.
Yeah.
You'll see me another week, right?
Okay.
Yeah, see you tomorrow.
Talk to you again tomorrow.
Now it's time for Onpoint, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. Of course, the one story we're all talking about here in South Korea today is the fact that all operating hour curbs are being lifted on restaurants and cafes in South Korea as the government begins this living with COVID-19 scheme. People who want to use venues deemed as high risk, such as gyms, saunas and bars, will now need to show a vaccine passport to gain entry.
Yes, but with new virus cases remaining above 2,000 for a fourth straight day on Sunday, could the easing of restrictions only exacerbate matters as the winter begins to set in? To get the answer to that question and more, we connect to Dr. Alice Tan, internist at Miss Mary Women's Hospital in Seoul. Good morning, doctor.
Good morning.
Now, first off, what's your opinion on the specifics of the government's plan and how effective it'll be and the timing of the rollout?
You know, in terms of the timing, my personal preference would have been to wait until we had more than 85% of the population fully vaccinated. And that's just based on what happened in Singapore. They have greater than 80%. Now it's 84% of their population fully vaccinated, and yet they had their worst day of COVID just a few days ago. And so based on what's happening overseas, I think I would have preferred until 85% of the population fully vaccinated and perhaps more than 50% of the vulnerable population having received boosters, I think would have been a safer time to engage in the living with COVID measures. In terms of the specifics, you know, now that we're living with COVID, I think the opening up of society is going to be much more geared towards people who have been fully vaccinated by use of the vaccine pass, as you mentioned. One worrisome aspect of the guidelines as stated right now is that there's no hard endpoints for when we would be triggered to go back in terms of pulling back if it looks like it's unsafe. The numbers that were stated was daily caseload, 7-day average, rolling average daily caseload of between 3,500 and 4,000 a day, and also greater than 60% hospital occupancy at the designated COVID hospitals. But in my opinion, it's only going to take a few weeks before we get to that level. And then for the stated guidelines, it said that they would convene an emergency meeting at that point. It's not that they would actually pull back. In terms of the effectiveness, you know, the fact of the matter is if you have more transmission, then you have more chances of developing mutations. And then with more mutations, you have more chances of developing a variant that will become dominant, again, just like the Delta variant became the dominant strain. And so I'm concerned with what's going to happen when we have more transmission in Korea.
Now, as Won Jung was just talking about before, officials are now only, or focus more heavily anyway, on the number of daily hospitalizations and deaths rather than overall cases, and broaden self-treatment for younger, healthier patients who only have mild symptoms. What do you think is the reasoning behind this change?
Well, obviously, people who are young and healthy and who get COVID, a lot of times they're completely asymptomatic or have only mild symptoms. And so we don't need to overburden the healthcare system with 24-hour medical monitoring of these very, very low-risk patients. And given the fact that we're anticipating an increase in the caseload, we've made the decision that we should keep people who are young and healthy, asymptomatic at home, and just do remote monitoring for them so that our healthcare system does not get overburdened.
And also, several nations that already rolled out living with COVID-19 schemes, such as Singapore and Russia, and a few others have had to reintroduce restrictions because they subsequently saw fresh surges. How likely is this to happen here as well? And if it does, do you think South Korea's response would be the same?
Well, you know, Korea has very high compliance with universal masking. I think almost 100%. You know, if you look around the street, you could hardly find a person without a mask on their face. On the other hand, Koreans have a tendency to do things in groups. That's the preference. And so there is a very high chance that once restrictions are lifted, that the case numbers will start to increase dramatically. And as I mentioned, there are some soft measures for when we would pull back. But, you know, historically, it's always taken a good several weeks for us to see calm COVID numbers after restrictions are implemented. It takes weeks to months to get back to baseline. And so that's what I'm concerned about, is just these very large lag times to get back to normal once we pull back from high levels of transmission.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that the mask wearing is like 100% in South Korea, because I honestly think I've never seen a person outside in South Korea without a mask on. But finally, before we let you go, living with COVID-19, just by that mere statement alone, suggests the government knows that COVID is going to be around forever. There's going to be outbreaks occurring every so often, much like influenza, no matter how many vaccines come out down the road. Do you believe COVID-19 is endemic worldwide and this virus will never be totally eradicated?
I think so. I think that it's pretty much spread out around the world so much that it can be considered an endemic disease. I think that there will be what we call antigenic drift. In other words, there will continue to be mutations such that at some point, our current vaccines will need to be updated in order to give the same level of protection. And this is the case, as you mentioned, with influenza. So we may have to, unfortunately, look forward to another booster or an updated vaccine sometime in the future. We're not exactly sure of the timing of that yet. We're still waiting for optimization of vaccination against COVID-19. But I do think that this is something we're going to have to deal with for many, many years, especially given that it's going to take at least another 1 to 2 years for us to get the level of vaccination out in the global community for everyone to start to feel safe again. We have to remember only 4% of people in middle and low income countries have received the vaccine. So we have a long ways to go.
All right, Dr. Tan, thank you as always for your insights. We appreciate your making room in your schedule to come on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Alice Tan from internists at Miss Mary Women's Hospital.
Now, moving on, President Moon Jae-in has reaffirmed South Korea's commitment to go carbon neutral by 2050. At the G20 Summit on Sunday, he introduced the country's efforts to slash coal consumption, as well as plans to reduce methane emissions. The South Korean leader also held summits with his counterparts from Australia and Germany. And President Moon will now join world leaders at the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Our Blue House correspondent Kim Min-ji, who's traveling with the president, follows us this report.
South Korea aims to completely phase out coal-fired power generation by 2050 to join global efforts to achieve carbon neutrality. President Moon Jae-in made the pledge during a G20 session on climate change on the second and final day of the Rome summit on Sunday. taking the G20 room to debut South Korea's policy roadmaps to achieve the 2050 carbon neutrality goal on the global stage. The president said although there remains 30 years until 2050, the next decade will be the make or break moment and called for global solidarity and cooperation. He said South Korea has shut down 8 coal power plants since this term began in 2017, plans to close down 2 more this year, and has also stopped funding overseas coal projects. Seoul will also join a global pact to cut methane emissions by 30% within the next decade. South Korea emitted some 28 million tons of methane in 2018 and plans to cut that down to under 20 million tons by 2030. Moon added that the country will join hands with developing nations in their efforts to go carbon neutral by boosting official development assistance in the field of green technology. On the margins of the multilateral summit, President Moon also held one-on-ones with his Australian and German counterparts. With Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, the two signed a partnership for low-emissions technologies, which is expected to serve as a platform for the commercialization of related technologies and reduce costs.
양국은 탄소 분야 또 우주 개발 분야에서도 협력을 강화하여 탄소 중립 사회로 진안에 함께하고 있습니다. 특히 수소 경제 협력에 대한 기대가 큽니다.
The leaders agreed that collaboration between South Korea's hydrogen-fueled vehicle technology and Australia's hydrogen energy production could create mutually beneficial synergies. In a sit-down with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, President Moon asked for Germany's continued support for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Moon also praised Merkel, who is set to step down after 16 years at the helm, for boosting South Korea-Germany relations in various sectors, including at the economic, political, and cultural level.
The spotlight now turns to the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Moon's next stop. There, the president will announce South Korea's new target for reducing carbon emissions to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News, Rome.
With mounting problems over supply chains holding back the global economic recovery, U.S. President Joe Biden held a summit on Sunday with his G20 counterparts in Rome. There, leaders agreed to cooperate to strengthen the system and get supply chains moving again. Chang Tae-hyun reports.
U.S. President Joe Biden hosted a supply chain meeting on Sunday during the annual gathering of G20 leaders. Discussed were ways to make pandemic-hit supply chains more resilient amid bottlenecks hampering the global economy.
Supply chains are something that most of our citizens never think twice about until something goes wrong. And during this pandemic, we've seen delays and backlogs of goods from automobiles to electronics, from shoes to furniture.
He added that ending the pandemic is the ultimate key to unlocking the disruptions, urging that action must be taken now. Biden said that vulnerability in the current system means there cannot be a return to business as usual and stressed the importance of being prepared for the future, as COVID-19 will not be the last health crisis. The U.S. president, along with leaders from 14 other countries and the European Union, agreed to foster greater international cooperation on near-term supply chain disruptions. In the meantime, South Korean President Moon Jae-in was the first person to make a comment after Biden's opening address. The U.S. has previously set the order of speakers, and the Blue House has said that this signifies South Korea's importance in recovering the global supply chain system. Aligning with President Biden's remarks, President Moon said stable global supply is urgent for a complete economic recovery. He added that the global logistics crisis is quickly becoming the biggest unstable factor in the global economy and joint action is needed. The South Korean leader also said to solve the logistics issues, international society and private companies have to find alternative transportation methods, manage transportation schedules, and share information. He said that South Korea is working on strengthening the cargo handling process and building joint distribution centers to tackle supply chain issues. Chang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
The joint communique issued by the G20 leaders also include the OECD-brokered global tax reform deal that has been already agreed by some 140 countries. The OECD estimates the new scheme will generate $125 billion in additional global tax revenue every year. Kim Hyo-san tells us more.
The leaders of the world's 20 wealthiest nations have formally endorsed a global minimum tax of 15% on big multinational companies during their first in-person meeting since the pandemic began. U.S. President Joe Biden hailed the deal as a, quote, game changer that's going to reshape the global economy. The most prominent feature of the deal, part of a reform plan inked by some 140 countries, is the 15% global minimum tax. This rate will be applied to multinationals with annual revenues of over $867 million, aiming to discourage companies from being able to avoid paying taxes by finding havens in other countries with low rates. Another vital part of the agreement is that it allows countries to levy taxes on large and profitable companies, not based on where they operate, but on where their goods and services are sold. The OECD, which is leading the initiative, estimates the scheme will generate $125 billion in additional global tax revenues annually after it comes into effect in 2023. This ads will be reallocated from about 100 of the world's largest multinationals, which could also include South Korea's Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix. The Wall Street Journal reported the major beneficiaries of the deal are likely to be rich countries, including the U.S. It explains Washington's additional revenues will be 15 times those of China. Kim Jung-sook, Arirang News.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi have locked horns over Taiwan, warning each other against moves that could further inflame tensions. During an hour-long meeting in Rome on Sunday, Blinken said he made it crystal clear that Washington opposes any unilateral changes by Beijing to the status quo regarding Taiwan. Wang expressed Beijing's concerns over the U.S. damaging China's rights and interests. He also urged Washington to change course and promote healthier U.S.-China ties. The two are meeting for the first time since their fiery meeting in Alaska back in March. Also on the sidelines of the G20 Summit, South Korea's Foreign Minister Jong Eun met his U.S. counterpart Antony Blinken for talks on Korean Peninsula issues. During their meeting Sunday, they discussed ways to restart the Korean Peninsula peace process, including the South Korean government's proposal for an end-of-war declaration. They also reaffirmed their alliance and cooperation on the global supply chain crisis and tackling the pandemic. The two also met a few weeks ago in Paris on the sidelines of an OECD meeting. Joining President Moon Jae-in in Italy, South Korea's First Lady Kim Jung-sook on Sunday met with teachers of the Korean language in Rome. She thanked and encouraged them, saying they're doing a wonderful job promoting the Korean language and Korean culture globally, despite the challenges posed by the pandemic. She also gave sets of a Korean traditional game to the students.
Despite some forecasts, Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party might lose its sole majority in the country's general election on Sunday. It actually performed much better than expected, with the party easily holding on to more than half the seats in the lower house. Bae Eun-ji with the details.
Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party held on to its majority in Sunday's parliamentary election, solidifying Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's position. Initial exit polls suggested the LDP could lose its sole majority, but the result defied expectations and the party retained control of the lower house. As of early Monday, Japan's public broadcaster NHK forecast that the LDP will win at least 253 seats in the 465-member lower house of parliament. Although this is fewer seats than the party held before the election, it easily exceeds the 233 needed for a majority. The LDP had 276 seats before the election. When combined with its junior coalition partner Komeito, the party secures more than 261 seats, required for an absolute stable majority, making it easier to pass bills. Prime Minister Kishida told reporters that his administration would attempt to put together an extra budget this year. The election was a test for Kishida, who became prime minister early last month, and his long-ruling Conservative Party, which has been slammed by its perceived mishandling of the pandemic. A poorer showing would have heightened expectations that Kishida could follow his predecessor Yoshihide Suga in becoming another short-term premier. A big winner in the election was the conservative Osaka-based Japan Innovation Party. The party is projected to surpass Komeito, becoming the third most powerful force in the lower house. after the opposition Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan. Turnout is forecast to be 55%, higher than the last election held in 2017. 배은지, Arirang News.
Now it's that part of New Day at Arirang where we cross over to our Ocean for global insight for an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insights, where we connect with experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Now, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and his party, the Liberal Democratic Party, sealed their parliamentary victory Sunday, according to exit polls, which show that their coalition bloc held on to most of their seats, albeit with a slim majority. Now, this means that the Conservative leaders is now set to roll out major policies to tackle the coronavirus, of course, but also major socio-economic as well as foreign policy issues amid geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China and the ongoing tension between Seoul and Tokyo. We discuss what's ahead for the new PM and his top agendas with Dr. Sayuri Shirai, Professor of Policy Management at Keio University. And we also have Dr. Kim Jung-sook, Professor of International Relations at Sogang University's Graduate School of International Studies. Very warm welcome to you both. And, well, now first things first, the economy. Japan's seen a deflation and low growth prevailing since the early 90s, and the recent pandemic caused the economy to shrink this year, taking a massive toll on manufacturing, export spending, as well as tourism. Then, well, what do you think should be Mr. Kishida's first moves to get the economy back into shape?
So before COVID-19 pandemic happened, the Japanese economy was just growing at the average rate of 1%, very low inflation, and this is mainly because of the declining population, aging society, and low productivity economies. So that's very difficult for the Mr. Kishida to change this situation. So what he said during this campaign, he said he want to bring back the economic situation just before the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and he want to do it mainly by doing massive fiscal stimulus. Probably he's going to do 20 and 30 trillion yen equivalent fiscal support. That is about 5% of GDP. But Japanese unemployment rate is already 2.8%, very low. So economy already started to pick up from this month because all the state of emergency positions were removed, so people can move freely. So economy is picking up, so he has to be careful about how much he want to spend to revive Japanese economy, given that our debt is already 260% of GDP.
Professor Shirai, now, of course, as you said, the economy has been picking up slightly, but in really reinvigorating the Japanese economy and creating a more equitable society, it does require some structural changes. And it's perhaps the biggest challenge that Mr. Kishida has as Prime Minister. And well, before he sealed his victory on Sunday, he proposed an income doubling plan along with a 20% tax on financial gains. But he appeared to later backtrack from this because the stock market plunged. What are your thoughts on this? How do you think Mr. Kishida needs to address this socio-economic conundrum?
So originally, I think Mr. Kishida had some doubt about Abenomics because, it led to the higher stock prices. But income inequality deteriorated. So he looked at the income level, including capital gain and wages, and above certain income, like 100 million Japanese yen, and then the people's income rate starts to go down. And this is mainly because of the higher stock prices. So he thought about charging higher taxes on such kind of dividend and capital gain, but then stock prices started to go down because of this policy. He quickly eliminated this policy. That was unfortunate because otherwise it's very difficult to cope with the inequality issue. So now he's saying he wants to provide tax advantages to the company who is going to raise wages. But under such a very weak economies, it's very difficult for the company to raise the base wage persistently. So that's quite challenging. And another thing he said is that he wants to raise the wages of nurses and care workers, but those are sort of set administratively. So unless he finds the sources to finance such kind of higher wages, it's very difficult to realize it. So at this moment, he hasn't really come up with a very comprehensive approach to cope with inequalities.
Then going beyond Abenomics, then, what do you hope to see as Mr. Kishida's signature economic policy?
Yes, so I think he has to put more focus on the long-term issue. Unfortunately, during this election campaign, no political group mentioned about long-term vision. So we have an aging society and labor shortage. So, we have to improve our labor productivity, and then we have to promote digitization. Still, Japanese public services are out of digitization, so very slow to do public support. For example, if the government wants to provide some cash transfer to the low-income people, because of the no digitization, it's a very slow process. So we have to really digitize our economies. We have to put more money to cope with the climate change, more sustainable economies. All those things haven't been discussed during the election campaigns.
Well, now bringing you into the conversation, Professor Kim. Now, Tokyo's foreign policy is also of great interest to observers in the region and also around the world, of course. And while Japan under Mr. Yoshihide Suga, it took a firm stand against Beijing and sided with Washington in their bilateral rift. But do you expect Kishida to maintain that position? How is he going to approach a Quad, and is that going to be the main focus of Japan's foreign policy?
Sure. I expect that Kishida would maintain foreign policy posture of the former Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga. And Suga inherited foreign policies from the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. So it's not really Suga's foreign policy that Kishida is inheriting. Rather, it's Abe's foreign policy that Kishida will be inheriting. So we'll have to remember that Kishida served as Japan's foreign minister under the Abe administration. As far as foreign policy is concerned, I think not much has changed from Abe to Suga, and not much is going to change from Suga to Kishida. If you really want to have a better understanding of Japan's foreign policy direction under the Kishida government, I think you'll have to understand Shinzo Abe's foreign policy first. And what was the essence of Shinzo Abe's foreign policy in this era of superpower rivalry? I think Abe's policy was to invest very heavily in Indo-Pacific strategy, thereby lending support to the United States. We'll have to remember there was Shinzo Abe, not Donald Trump, who coined the term FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Of course, Donald Trump later adopted FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific, as American strategy, but it was Shinzo Abe's idea. And it was Shinzo Abe who transformed Tsunami Core Group to a more comprehensive security dialogue between the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, which is now dubbed as Quad. So sure, Quad is going to remain as an important part of Japan's foreign policy.
So I suppose we can expect a continuation of Mr. Abe's policies. But Professor Kim, like Korea, though, Japan's been carefully maintaining its relationship with the US and China over the years. But what really caused it to really side decisively with the US?
You're right, Soo-young. I think Japan is also trying to maintain the precarious balance between the United States and China in their foreign policy. But that said, Japan has been more proactive in supporting American foreign policy initiatives. In contrast, South Korea has been rather reactive. Why is that? I think it has something to do with the different geopolitical locations of two countries. Korea is located in this geopolitical hotspot where we'll have to maintain good relations both with the United States and China, while Japan is more distant, distant from China. That means Japan has more room to maneuver. On top of that, South Korea has this North Korea problem, and we tend to believe that we have to be nice to China to elicit China's support to our unification policy and to policy to resolve North Korea's nuclear problems. But more importantly, I think Japan understands better than South Koreans, that if China keeps rising the way it has, and China has been undermining the rule-based liberal international order and suppressing democracies and human rights at home and then abroad. So Japan is thinking if China keeps doing this, eventually it'll do irreparable damage to Japan's national interests as well. That, I think, is the major reason why Japan has been more proactive in lending support to American foreign policy, to safeguard the rule-based international order and democracies and human rights.
And of course, there have been tensions a bit closer to home for Mr. Kishida as well. Professor Shirei, Seoul and Tokyo have been engaged in a bilateral spat, which has hurt businesses on both sides. Do you see any areas of cooperation where the two could really mend their economic relations that really plummeted in 2019, particularly during this time of pandemic-induced difficulty?
So between Korea and Japan? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think, Japan and Korea, we are so close to each other geographically, and we appreciate this democracy and, rule of law. And then I think we can do much more cooperation, especially economically. Right now, globally, and Japan, also many other countries, semiconductor, we are in shortage of semiconductors. And because of that, Japan cannot produce the automobile and cannot export. So, and Japan is now going to bring one Taiwanese factory to Japan so that we can get more semiconductor. But in the future, Japan is an aging society and declining population, so market is shrinking. So I think, Japan and Korea can work together in terms of how to coordinate this supply of semiconductor and also many other precious metal, rare earth metal, which are needed to be used for the electric vehicle, renewable energy, batteries, and so on. I mean, we can collaborate, how to recycle and how to share those important materials.
And Professor Kim, well, Fumio Kishida actually worked on the 2015 bilateral agreement between Seoul and Tokyo to really resolve the issue of Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of Korean women. How do you think he's going to approach these issues of historical dispute?
Kishida is not going to be more open to dialogues with South Korea. You mentioned that bilateral agreement on comfort women issue. Actually, wartime sex slaves is more accurate word here. Anyways, Kishida was Japan's foreign minister at that time, and he put in significant efforts to hammer out that deal. So he understands the importance of the deal. And for South Korea to unilaterally scrap that deal was not really well received by Kishida. And Japan's public opinion is not really favorable to South Korea. Japan's public opinion is that Japan should maintain rough or tough posture to South Korea because Japan's public believes that South Korea unilaterally reneged on early agreements on comfort women issue and also forced labor victim issue. So I think it's politically more appropriate for Japan's politicians and particularly Prime Minister to maintain tough stance toward South Korea. Prime Minister Kishida and President Moon Jae-in had a phone conversation a couple of weeks ago, but it was reported that Kishida was very adamant about comfort women issue and the forced labor issue, and he said that the ball is really in South Korea's court, and South Korea will have to come up with more creative solutions to these issues. So I don't think there's going to be any breakthrough in Korea-Japan relations in any time soon.
And Professor Kim, well, like you, many expect that there's not going to be a breakthrough anytime soon, and many actually expect the Japanese administration to wait out and see who the next South Korean president is going to be before solidifying Tokyo's policy towards its neighbour. But perhaps that was the problem over the years, the partisan differences over Korea-Japan relations. They're pronounced on both sides of the EC. And, well, how has politics affected bilateral relations? And do you think any of these issues can be overcome?
Right, Soo-young, domestic politics and political considerations weigh very heavily in both countries. Say that you're a politician in South Korea and you say something that can be interpreted as siding with Japan or anything pro-Japan, your political career is pretty much over. I think that goes to Japan's politicians and then politics as well. albeit to a less extent. If a conservative candidate wins South Korea's presidential election in March next year, it's possible for that new conservative president to be more proactive in mending fences with Japan. It's possible for that new president to invent more creative measures to break the stalemate. But that said, no matter who wins the presidential election next year, there's not going to be about face in South Korea's policy toward Japan, because doing so is politically suicidal. So my advice to Japan and to South Korea is that it is in the interest of both countries to mend fences as early as possible, rather than waiting for a change in leadership.
And before we go, Professor Shirai, now, for months there have been questions surrounding the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and whether the United States is going to join. But now China's made things a bit awkward by applying to join after Taiwan did. And while right now a lot of things look uncertain, how do you think Japan's going to really set the direction of the CPTPP?
Yes, so Japan was really hoping that U.S. would come back. And that was the main purpose of, this construction of TPP to begin with. But unfortunately, President Biden hasn't shown strong interest about coming back, because he wanted to do renegotiation. That makes it very difficult for other members to accept as a new members. So given this situation, so that the application from China and Taiwan, it's a good thing to have extending members. But I think it's quite challenging because this CPTPP is quite a stringent framework than RCEP. So that if the China want to participate, they have to lower the tariff on the industrial goods, and they have to do some reform on SOE and subsidies, and also their intellectual property rights. All are very challenging. So, but the China have to do some improvement. So we have to see how soon and how aggressively China is going to change. I think just setting aside the political issue, China still has to meet those requirements. Now, Taiwan is very important for Japan and for many countries, because Taiwan is the epicenter of the very important semiconductor product. So I think bringing the Taiwan to this framework, it would really benefit to the many member countries. So but for the Japan side, so selecting these two regions, China and Taiwan, is a very politically sensitive. But I hope that China can do some improvement about their policies.
I see. Well, this is where we're going to have to wrap up today. That was Dr. Soyuri Shirai, Professor at Keio University, and Dr. Kim Jung-sook, Professor at Sogang University's Graduate School of International Studies. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Saudi Arabia's state-run oil giant says its third-quarter net profits were up 158% on year, hitting $30.4 billion. Aramco explained Sunday that this increase was primarily backed by higher crude oil prices and volumes sold, as well as rebounding global energy demand and increased economic activity in key markets. It also declared a Q3 dividend of $18.8 billion, in line with its guidance. Hyundai Motor and Kia Motors are reporting strong global sales of their two all-new electric cars. They are the Ioniq 5 and the EV6. Including the Korean market, over the past 6 months, they've shifted 50,000 units. Hyundai's model was launched in April and Kia's came out in August. Both models set all-time highs for pre-orders. South Korea has been importing more electric cars as well. In the first 9 months of 2021, imports were up 52% to around 20,000 units, about the same as domestic sales of Korean models. Of those imports, Tesla accounted for more than 80%.
Kyongju City, full of cultural heritage, could be a good place to visit on this time of the year. Other than the famous cultural assets, there's also a theme park that's perfect for families with children. Kim Bo-kyung gives us a tour.
Dubbed a historical gem, Kyongju City in Gyeongsang-buk-do province is packed full of cultural assets. Those include Cheomseongdae, the celestial observatory that shows the Silla Kingdom's technology, and House of the Che family, a typical home for the wealthy aristocracy of the Joseon era. A more modern site is Kyongju Expo Grand Park, which has been attracting lots of visitors recently.
Kyongju Expo Grand Park is where the Kyongju World Culture Expo has taken place since 1998. For 10 times until 2019, we have shown the Silla Kingdom's exquisite cultural heritage content, fusing analog and digital forms. And now it has become a theme park that runs 24/7.
The centerpiece of Kyongju Expo Grand Park is the 82-meter-high Kyongju Tower, featuring a life-sized engraved replication of the 9-story wooden pagoda of Hwangnongsa Temple. The contemporary structure is an observatory to look over the surrounding landscape and imagine what it would be like to see what was the highest wooden tower in the world when it was built under Queen Seondok's reign during the Silla Kingdom. Nearby is the Historical Art Museum, which displays art pieces by a Korean painter Sosan Park Dae-sung, inspired by Kyongju's cultural treasures. And cutting-edge technology is used to make modern art based on Silla's crowns and the divine bell of King Seongdok.
Kyongju is a representative tourist spot embracing a number of national treasures and world heritages. However, to some, those assets could feel a little static. The Grand Park supplements such needs as a complex cultural theme park where people can enjoy high-tech content.
At night, the place turns into a real theme park. As Halloween approaches, the walking trail is full of spooky lights and actors in scary costumes. Thousands of people, especially families, visit the spot to enjoy the spooky atmosphere.
It's very nice to study history during the day and enjoy ourselves at night.
It's a great idea to introduce a popular event like Halloween to make the cultural heritage site feel much more accessible to people.
Combining cultural heritage with modern technology and popular events, the park looks to give visitors a different kind of experience. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News, Kyongju.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. One of the largest mosaic panels in the world has finally been unveiled after $12 million and years of restoration at Hisham's Palace in Jericho in the occupied West Bank. The massive piece was unveiled by the Palestinian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities on Sunday, showing an Umayyad-era piece with 38 carpet-like mosaic panels covering a total of 827 square meters. To ensure visitors can enjoy the site without treading on it, elevated platforms were built. The ministry hopes the mosaic piece will increase the number of tourists in Jericho.
We are proud of the opening of one of the largest mosaics in the world, and hopefully this will increase the number of tourists who visit, whether specialists, architects, or regular tourists to this location.
According to the ministry, the dome was made out of eco-friendly material, which works as an insulator, able to maintain temperature in a manner that preserves the mosaic floors. Ahead of the COP26 Climate Summit in Scotland, the French branch of the Extinction Rebellion Environmental Action Group held a Halloween-themed protest in Paris on Sunday. The protesters in costumes and face paint gathered at a shopping center in the French capital, warning of the horrors of climate change inaction.
We all live in a single biodiversity, and that means it's not humans versus nature. It's humans in nature. And if we don't change our way of life now, not just on the individual level, but on the global level, we can't continue on like this, and we'll meet our end very, very quickly.
The protest comes as world leaders will hold the COP26 summit on Monday, with 2 days of speeches that could include some new emissions-cutting pledges. Halloween was no laughing matter in Japan, as a 24-year-old man dressed as the Joker attacked passengers on a Tokyo train line on Sunday, injuring 17 people before he was arrested on the spot. According to local media, a man in his 60s is in critical condition after being stabbed, while witnesses also say the attacker had sprayed fluid around the train and started a fire. Some of the passengers thought it was a Halloween stunt before seeing the suspect holding a bloody knife. The attack occurred on the Keio Express line bound for Shinjuku, the world's busiest railway station, as many partygoers were headed into the city center for Halloween gatherings. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Good morning. Parts of the West will need to watch out for high levels of fine dust today, and especially those in Chungcheongbuk-do province will have to breathe in bad air all day today, while surrounding regions will see levels going up in the first half of the day. And it's the first day of November today and a milder start than yesterday, but afternoon highs will be about 4 degrees lower here in the capital, still not too bad. Then chillier air will sweep into the country tonight. It's a foggy start in inland regions. Daegu and Kyongju are starting out the day at 8 degrees Celsius, but those two regions will notice a huge jump in readings by the afternoon, as it will go up to 21 degrees Celsius. And Busan will top out at 23 degrees this afternoon. Still in the 20s in southern provinces, and skies will also be mostly sunny, while central regions will be covered with lots of clouds all day today. While up and down temperatures to continue, while highs will remain on the warmer side at the end of the week. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Tuesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
Yes, thank you for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow, as Mo-gyan said. And for the rest of the week at the same time, I'll be back minus Mo-gyan at 10 a.m. Korea time with our next newscast. Until then, goodbye.